In Willow Grove, a quiet town in the American Midwest, the murder of 22-year-old Alex Carson shocked the community. What seemed to be a home invasion gone wrong turned into a story of forbidden love, betrayal, and murder. At the center was Alex's stepmother, Victoria Carson. Victoria Carson was a woman who had everything. She was married to Richard Carson, a successful businessman in Willow Grove. Richard owned a construction company known for its integrity and hard work. He was a pillar of the community. His dedication to his work provided his family with the Carsons lived in a large, beautiful house on the outskirts of Willow Grove. It was a symbol of the American dream. Richard and Victoria had been married for nearly a decade and seemed happy. Victoria was in her early 40s and still looked like a former beauty queen. She was graceful and elegant. Even now, years after her pageant days, she was beautiful and sophisticated. She was active in the community and often seen at charity events. Her home was a gathering place for the town's elite. On the surface, she seemed to be the perfect wife. Victoria was loving and devoted to her husband, but she was also unhappy. Richard was busy with work and didn't spend time with her. He wanted to provide for his family, but he didn't see that she was growing apart from him. The couple's conversations had dwindled to brief exchanges about mundane matters. Victoria, who had once been the center of attention, now found herself isolated and unfulfilled. Alex, Richard's son from his first marriage, had recently moved back home after completing college. He was a bright young man eager to start his career. He had always been close to his father, but their relationship had become strained. Despite the challenges, Alex was determined to make his father proud. He had returned to Willow Grove to start his career in the marketing department of Richard's construction company. He wanted to learn the ropes and eventually take over the family business. The Carson family seemed close-knit and loving. Friends and neighbors saw them as the embodiment of the American dream. Victoria was following in her father's footsteps, but appearances were deceiving. She was lonely and dissatisfied. She began to take notice of her stepson, Alex. He was everything she felt was missing in her life. He was young, vibrant, and full of energy. He was ambitious and had a sense of adventure. He reminded her of the excitement and passion she had once felt in her youth. What began as innocent conversations and shared interests soon became something more. Victoria found herself drawn to Alex. She was captivated by his youthful charm and the attention he gave her. She dismissed her growing feelings for Alex as nothing more than a harmless infatuation. She was aware of the boundaries she was crossing, but she couldn't help the feelings that were beginning to stir within her. The attraction was undeniable. It wasn't long before the lines between familial bonds and something far more illicit began to blur. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't resist Alex. He was oblivious to her feelings at first. He admired his stepmother, but as their conversations grew more personal, he noticed a change in Victoria's behavior. He was her arm during casual touches. It all felt different. Despite the warning bells, Alex was intrigued by the attention Victoria gave him. He was flattered and excited. Late-night talks in the kitchen became more intimate. They talked late into the night, sharing stories, hopes, and dreams. The kitchen was their private sanctuary. These conversations filled with glances and touches became the foundation of a relationship neither of them could ignore. The tension between them grew with each passing day. They knew their feelings for each other were inappropriate, even immoral, but the excitement of the forbidden was intoxicating. It was exciting to sneak around, to risk being caught. It made their feelings stronger. They kept pushing the boundaries, testing what they could get away with. Then, when Richard was away, they gave in to their desires. What began as a simple conversation in the kitchen quickly became intense. After weeks of building tension, they finally gave in to their desires. For Victoria, the affair was a thrilling escape from her life. She became obsessed with the excitement of her relationship with Alex. The secrecy, and the intensity of their encounters were exhilarating. But beneath the excitement, Victoria felt guilty. She knew she was betraying her husband, but she couldn't stop the affair. Alex was also conflicted. He was attracted to Victoria but knew what they were doing was wrong. He felt guilty and anxious, torn between his love for Victoria and his knowledge that their relationship was wrong and wouldn't last. If Richard found out, it would ruin their family. But he couldn't stop thinking about Victoria. As time passed, keeping their secret became harder. Victoria was distant from Richard, and Alex avoided him, afraid he'd find out. The affair was obvious to those around them, but no one knew what was really going on. Friends and neighbors noticed Victoria and Alex's changes, but they thought it was just stress. They didn't know about the secret that was tearing the Carson family apart. The affair was exciting at first, but it started to spiral out of control. They both knew that they were in over their heads. They knew they couldn't continue the affair, but neither of them was willing to let go. It had become an addiction. As the pressure mounted, Victoria became possessive and paranoid. She feared that Alex might lose interest or that their secret might be exposed. These fears only fueled her obsession, leading her to become more demanding and controlling. She began to isolate Alex, insisting that he spend more and more time with her. From his friends and even his work, the once confident and independent woman was now consumed by a dangerous obsession. Her love for Alex turned into something dark and destructive. Alex felt suffocated by Victoria's growing obsession and began to pull away. He realized that their relationship was spiraling out of control and that something had to change. The guilt and anxiety that had plagued him from the beginning were now unbearable. He knew that the only way to regain some sense of normalcy, he would stop seeing Victoria. But breaking free from their intense connection would be difficult. One evening, Alex was overwhelmed by guilt and anxiety. He decided to end the affair. He knew their relationship was unsustainable. He had to end it completely. It wasn't just about stopping the affair. It was about reclaiming his life. He knew that continuing would ruin everyone. Victoria was devastated. The affair was her life. She couldn't live without him. She begged him to stay. To keep their relationship alive, Alex was ready to leave. He understood the danger and knew their relationship had to end. Victoria couldn't accept Alex's decision and began to unravel her love for him. She became erratic and obsessed with him. The thought of losing him consumed her. She couldn't imagine life without him. She stalked Alex, leaving him frantic messages and following him. The more Alex pulled away, the more Victoria tightened her grip. She refused to let go of the one thing that had people noticed Victoria's change in behavior. She was no longer polished and composed. She was frayed and desperate. Richard, who was unaware of the affair, noticed the tension between his wife and son. He didn't understand why Victoria was distant and why Alex avoided him. Richard, who was a businessman, assumed it was stress. The pressures of work and family life were taking their toll. He tried to reach out to both Victoria and Alex, but they gave vague reassurances that everything was fine. Richard trusted his family and didn't press further. As the weeks passed, the situation grew increasingly volatile. Victoria was driven by her obsession and paranoia. She began to entertain dark thoughts. The idea that Alex might find someone else and leave her behind was too much for her to bear. Her jealousy turned to rage. On a cold winter night, as snow blanketed the quiet streets of Willow Grove, Victoria's obsession reached its deadly conclusion. She lured Alex to the house, claiming she needed closure. She wanted to part on good terms. Alex wanted to believe that Victoria was finally willing to let go and agreed to meet her. When he arrived at the house, he found Victoria waiting for him. She greeted him with a strained smile and led him into the living room, where the fireplace crackled softly. Alex thought that maybe they could end things amicably. Things were going well, but as the conversation went on, it became clear that Victoria was not ready to let him go. She begged him to stay with her, but Alex was firm. He told her that it was over and that they needed to move on. He tried to be kind, knowing how much she was hurting, but he also knew that their relationship was toxic and would only lead to more pain. In that moment, something inside Victoria snapped. She lost control and grabbed a heavy object from the fireplace. She struck Alex on the head with all her strength. He fell to the floor, bleeding but still alive. Victoria realized what she had done and was filled with panic. Like a freight train, she was consumed by fear and desperation. She knew she couldn't turn back. She kept hitting Alex. Her emotions swung wildly between panic and despair. Each strike was fueled by the twisted logic that if she couldn't have Alex, then no one would. Alex lay motionless on the floor. Victoria dropped the poker and stared at him. The reality of the situation hit her like a suffocating blanket. The man she loved was dead by her hand. There was no time to grieve. Victoria began to plan to cover up the crime. She tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. She overturned drawers, overturned furniture, and scattered items around the house in a futile attempt to create the illusion of a break-in. Her efforts were sloppy, rushed, and driven by blind panic. She knew deep down that there was no way to truly cover up what she had done. The rest of the night, she spent cleaning up as much evidence as she could, trying to erase any trace of the affair. She deleted text messages, wiped down surfaces, and disposed of anything that might link her to the crime. But she couldn't erase the bloodstains, signs of a struggle, or the evidence of what had really happened. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating her as she frantically tried to create a version of events that would exonerate her. When the sun rose the next morning, Victoria was a shell of herself. She knew Richard would be home soon. The truth would come out. She had done wrong, but she hoped the police would believe it was an accident. As the minutes passed, she realized she was wrong. When Richard came home, he found the house in disarray. The door was open, the furniture overturned, and there was a strange silence. Richard called for his wife and son, but there was no answer. He stepped further into the house and saw Alex's body in the living room. His son was dead. The world collapsed around him. He fell to his knees beside Alex's body. The man who had built an empire was now powerless. He called the police. His voice was shaky. He tried to explain what he'd found. The police arrived. They started their investigation. The death of Alex Carson led to an investigation. Despite Victoria's efforts, evidence pointed to her. Her fingerprints were on the weapon. Her attempts to stage the robbery were amateurish. The inconsistencies in her statements raised suspicion. The final piece of evidence was text messages between Victoria and Alex. They revealed the true nature of their relationship. Their relationship, the affair, and the tension before the murder made it impossible for Victoria to keep up the pretense. The woman who had once been perfect broke down and confessed to killing her stepson. She was no longer the elegant, poised woman she had been. She was a woman broken. Victoria's confession was chilling. She recounted the affair with Alex, how it had started and consumed her life. She spoke of passion, thrill, and obsession. The detectives listened in stunned silence. This was not just a tragic love affair gone wrong. It was a tale of manipulation. The story doesn't end there. The affair between Victoria and Alex and the murder shocked the town of Willow Grove. The Carsons were respected, and the idea that such a story had unfolded within their home was hard to believe. People were shocked by what they saw. Friends, neighbors, and others struggled to understand how Victoria could have done such a thing. The trial was a big deal. People from all over came to watch. Victoria looked different now. She was thin and looked sick. She stood in court and was accused of killing her stepson. The prosecution painted a picture of Victoria as a jealous, rage-filled woman. They presented evidence of the affair and tied her to the crime with text messages and forensic evidence. The cast iron poker, stained with Alex's blood, symbolized the violence. The prosecution argued that Victoria was driven by a twisted sense of possession and that her love for Alex had turned into a dangerous obsession. The defense argued that Victoria had been driven to murder him by loneliness, neglect, and a deep sense of inadequacy. They said that the affair had filled a void in her life and that her actions were the result of a temporary lapse in sanity. Her attorney asked for leniency, saying that Victoria's life had already been destroyed by her choices. He said she was not a cold-blooded killer but a broken woman who made a terrible mistake. Victoria was mostly silent, seeming sad and without spirit. She looked down as the evidence was presented. She broke down when the text messages between her and Alex were read aloud in court. They showed the relationship that had once brought her joy but led to her downfall. The jury deliberated for several days, but they could not reach a verdict. Was Victoria a cold-blooded killer or a victim of her own desperate emotions? In the end, the jury found Victoria Carson guilty of first-degree murder. The judge acknowledged the tragedy of the case but emphasized the seriousness of the crime. Victoria Carson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was now a convicted murderer. Everyone involved was scarred by the trial. Richard Carson was devastated by the loss of his son and his wife's betrayal. He withdrew from public life and sold the family estate. He moved away from Willow Grove, seeking solace in anonymity. He was consumed by grief and guilt. He struggled to move on from the tragedy that had shattered his life. The town of Willow Grove was forever changed. The Carson family was once admired, but now the community was divided. Some blamed Richard for being blind to the affair. Others questioned Victoria. People wondered if there had been signs of her instability that had gone unnoticed. The murder of Alex Carson became a cautionary tale. Victoria, who had once been admired and envied, was now just another inmate. Her beauty and charm faded. Her life became a series of monotonous days in a cold gray cell. She spent her days in solitude, reflecting on the life she had destroyed, the family she had torn apart, and the love that had led her to commit an unspeakable crime. The story of the Carson family remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of secrets, lies, and unchecked emotions. What began as a forbidden love affair driven by loneliness and a desire for excitement ended in a brutal murder. In the quiet suburban town of Briarwood, everyone knew each other and nothing ever seemed to change. But a dark secret was taking shape. The residents were used to gossip, but as events at Briarwood High School unfolded, it became clear that reality could be far darker. What started as a forbidden romance would spiral into a horrifying tale of obsession and betrayal. Olivia Warren was a 34-year-old English teacher. She was respected and admired for her passion for teaching and her ability to connect with her students. She could make even the most disinterested teenager appreciate classic literature. Her students often sang her praises at home. However, Olivia's life was not as ideal as it appeared. She was married for nearly 10 years to Mark, a successful real estate agent. She had grown disillusioned with her marriage. Her marriage had become boring. She felt trapped and unhappy. It was then that she first noticed Josh Matthews. He was a confident 17-year-old student who had been one of her best. Josh was everything she had loved about her life. He was intelligent, well-liked, and charismatic. Josh was struggling. His parents were divorcing, and he was stressed about school, sports, and his chaotic home life. Olivia saw the pain in his eyes. He started staying after class to ask for advice. He poured out his frustrations about his parents fighting and how helpless he felt. She listened and offered guidance and comfort. They started talking and soon became close. One day, after a sad talk about his family, Josh stayed at school later than usual. The halls were empty and the quiet classroom made the air heavy with unspoken words. Olivia, sitting across from Josh at her desk, put a hand on his shoulder to comfort him. It was meant to be a simple gesture, but something shifted. Neither of them spoke, but the tension between them was undeniable. Olivia could feel the intensity of his gaze. His eyes searched hers for something. Maybe even desire. She should have moved. Ended the silence. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Then, Josh leaned forward. His breath soft against her skin. It was a small gesture. But Olivia felt it, ripple through her. A quiet current pulling her in. His lips brushed hers. The world seemed to stop. She could feel her pulse hammering in her. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, but she didn't. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an escape. The walls of her orderly life crumbled as they fell into each other. Passion ignited between them. They pulled apart, both breathless. Their eyes were wide with the gravity of what had just happened. Olivia's mind whirled. Guilt and fear led her to cross a dangerous line. Despite her status as a married woman and her student's age, she couldn't bring herself to end it. The thrill was too intoxicating. They began meeting in secret. The forbidden nature of their relationship only heightened the intensity. They started exchanging text messages late at night, professing their feelings for one another. Josh had a crush on his teacher, but it had grown into something more intense. He thought about Olivia all the time. He wasn't just infatuated, he was obsessed. He replayed their interactions in his mind and analyzed every word and glance. He wanted proof that she felt the same way. At first, the kisses and whispered conversations were enough. But it wasn't long before Josh craved more. He wanted her all to himself. He wanted her to belong to him. He thought of her going back to her ordinary life and made his blood boil. How could she not see that they were meant for each other? The more they met in secret, the more Josh's feelings deepened. From admiration to obsession, he waited outside her classroom for hours, desperate for just a few minutes of her time. When she wasn't around, he obsessed over their messages. His heart raced, but it was never enough. He needed her, and with each passing day, his need grew stronger. Olivia was blinded by her own need for validation and excitement. She didn't see the warning signs that Josh's feelings were becoming more obsessive. He started showing up uninvited. Olivia expected this, but it was starting to feel suffocating. She knew she needed to put a stop to it, but Josh would pull her back in. Each time she tried to distance herself, he promised he would be better. Things were about to take an even darker turn. The cracks in Olivia's life were beginning to show. Mark was getting further and further apart. He didn't know that Olivia was having an affair. He tried to get her back, but she wasn't interested. He wanted to fix their marriage, but she didn't want to. Meanwhile, Josh was getting more obvious about his feelings for Olivia. He was obsessed with Olivia. He would wait outside her classroom and stare at her. His obsession was becoming obvious. Soon, people at Briarwood High were whispering about a possible relationship. Olivia's colleagues noticed her erratic behavior. She was distracted in meetings. Her lesson plans were sloppy and rushed. She was losing control of her life. Josh's possessiveness was becoming dangerous. He was jealous of Olivia spending time with anyone else. He accused her of not caring about him. The once sweet and adoring boy was angry and volatile. But Olivia was overwhelmed by guilt and fear. She couldn't end the affair. She knew she couldn't continue living this double life. The world was on the verge of colliding. If anyone found out about the affair, she would lose everything. She was trapped. She was torn between losing her job, her marriage, and her reputation. She was also torn between her fear of what Josh might do if she tried to walk away. But things were changing. Step by step, things were changing. Olivia lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. The guilt clung to her like a weight pressing down on her chest. It suffocated her every time she thought about Josh and what they had done. She felt sick. A wave of dread washed over her. She had crossed a line she couldn't undo. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. The worst part was that she couldn't stay away. Josh made her feel alive and desired. She needed him. Every time she looked at him, every time their hands touched, she felt it. Hands brushed or their eyes met across the room. It was like a drug. She needed him. She craved him. She knew it was destroying everything. But lately, something had shifted. Josh's messages had become more frequent and more demanding. He wanted more. She was running out of excuses. She tried to regain control over her life. But Josh's grip on her tightened by the day. His behavior became erratic. His once charming demeanor dissolved. He started following her home and watching her. He flooded her phone with messages. Olivia, who had once found solace and excitement in their secret relationship, was now feeling the weight of Josh's obsession. She could barely concentrate in class. She would glance at the door during lessons. Olivia's classmates noticed her strange behavior. Rumors about her were spreading. Some suspected the truth, but no one had the courage to come forward. Olivia decided it was time to end things with Josh. She had spent many sleepless nights worrying about what would happen if their affair came to light. She feared what Josh might do if she didn't take control of the situation. The next day, she asked him to meet her after school. They met in a nearby park. When Josh arrived, there was tension. Olivia began to explain her decision. She said, "This has gone too far. We can't keep doing this. I'm your teacher, and you're a student. It's wrong, and we both know it. I'm sorry, but we have to end this." But Josh wasn't willing to accept that. His face darkened, and the warmth and affection he once showed her were replaced by something far more menacing. "You can't just leave me, Olivia," he whispered. His voice trembled with emotion. "I love you. I need you. You're the only." Olivia felt her heart pound. She was scared. She had underestimated how much Josh loved her. She had to be strong. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "This has to end." Josh's face showed anger. He stepped closer. He growled, "You don't get to just walk away from me." Olivia felt the situation crashing down on her. She had thought ending the affair would be enough to make Josh let go, but she hadn't considered how deeply he had become entangled in his obsession. She'd never imagined that he might become dangerous. Over the next few days, Josh's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would show up outside her classroom watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to confront her again. Olivia's anxiety reached an all-time high. She started avoiding places where they might run into each other. Josh wasn't giving up. His texts became more threatening. He would leave messages like, "If I can't have you, no one will, and you'll regret leaving me, Olivia." Each new message made her fear for her safety. One evening, Olivia returned home from work exhausted. She hadn't heard from Josh in hours. She briefly believed he'd accepted the breakup. But as she pulled into her driveway, her stomach dropped. Josh was sitting in his car across the street, looking at her. He didn't get out of his car, but he was there. Olivia felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She went inside, locked the door, and shut the blinds. Her heart was racing. She fumbled for her phone, thinking about calling the police. What would she say? She knew she had crossed a line. And now she was terrified of the consequences. But there was more. Olivia's husband Mark had also begun to notice the cracks in his wife's behavior. She was pulling away from him. Mark had no idea why. One night, Mark found Olivia's phone buzzing with notifications. He unlocked it and saw messages from Josh. He couldn't believe it. His wife had been having an affair with a student. He was shocked. Anger, betrayal, and confusion flooded Mark. How could he have missed the signs? Fury replaced his initial shock as he read the messages. Josh was dangerous. Mark confronted Olivia the next morning. He demanded to know what had happened. Olivia's heart sank. She tried to explain, but Mark was already gone. She tried to explain, but there was no way to excuse what she had done. Mark's trust was shattered, and Olivia knew their marriage was over. But now Josh's obsession was no longer a secret. Josh's behavior was becoming more threatening by the day, and Mark was aware of everything. She didn't know how to stop the impending disaster. The fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks was now terror. Then came the night that would change everything. It was dark and quiet. Olivia sat alone in her living room. She was nervous after Mark left that morning. The house felt cold. The silence was heavy. Mark had left earlier and hadn't returned. Olivia thought about the past few weeks. She tried to stop the affair, but it was too late. She was left to face the consequences. She checked the windows constantly, afraid of Josh. Her phone buzzed with messages from him, each one more threatening. She didn't open them, but every vibration sent a fresh wave of dread through her. She knew he was watching her. She sat in the dark. Her phone went silent. No more messages, no more calls. It was as though Josh had vanished. The quiet was unnerving. Olivia stared at her phone. She heard a knock at the door. Her heart pounded. She froze, staring at the door. It was too late for a visitor. She stood slowly, every instinct telling her to run. She screamed at her to stay put, but something made her go to the door. She looked through the peephole and saw no one. She was confused and on edge. She stepped back, her hands trembling. Was it her imagination? She heard a noise from the back of the house. She turned and walked towards the kitchen. Her heart was pounding. Olivia saw the back door was slightly ajar. The lock had been broken. She grabbed a kitchen knife. She had to call the police, but her phone slipped from her grasp. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. She was afraid. Josh was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of rage and hurt. His eyes were wild, his hands clenched. He had broken into her house, and there was no escape. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Olivia backed away, the knife still in her trembling hand. "Please, Josh," she whispered. "You need to leave. This isn't right." "Go," Josh said, but he wasn't listening. He was obsessed with her and didn't know what he was doing. He took a step toward her, his eyes filled with a dangerous intensity. "You promised," he growled. "You said you'd never leave me." Olivia's heart was pounding, but she tried to reason with him. "We can't be together," she said. "You have to understand that." But her words only seemed to fuel his anger. Josh lunged at her, and Olivia barely had time to react. She tried to slash the knife, but Josh knocked it from her hand. They struggled and fell against the kitchen table and chairs, knocking everything over. Josh was stronger and soon had Olivia pinned against the wall. She could feel his breath hot against her face. "You don't get to leave me," he snarled. He spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. "If I can't have you, no one can." The words sent a wave of terror through Olivia. She fought with all her strength, kicking and pushing, but Josh was relentless. His grip tightened around her throat, and Olivia gasped for air. Her vision blurred, and she clawed his arms, trying to break free. But the more she struggled, the harder he squeezed. In that moment, Olivia realized that Josh was willing to kill her. When she thought it was over, there was a loud crash from the front of the house. The sound startled Josh, and he loosened his grip. Olivia took her chance and shoved him off her. She stumbled away and collapsed on the floor. Mark stood in the doorway, shocked and furious. He had returned home to find the door broken and his wife being attacked. Mark rushed at Josh and tackled him. And threw him to the ground. The two men struggled and fought. Olivia watched in horror. Her body was too weak to move. She tried to call out to stop them, but her voice was barely a whisper. The fight got worse. Punches were thrown and objects knocked over. Then, there was a sickening thud. Josh had grabbed the knife from the floor. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Olivia's eyes widened in horror as she saw the knife blade in Josh's hand, dripping with blood. The blade was dripping with blood. Adam staggered back, clutching his stomach. His face was pale with shock. Blood seeped through his fingers as he collapsed to the ground. Olivia screamed. Her voice was raw with terror. Josh stood over Mark's body. He looked down at the man he had just stabbed. His face was twisted with confusion. For a moment, it seemed like he couldn't comprehend what he had done. He dropped the knife and stepped away from Mark. His eyes were wide with disbelief. Olivia crawled toward Mark, pressing against the wound to stop the bleeding. Mark's breaths grew shallower, his eyes glazed over as the life drained from him. Olivia screamed as her heart shattered into a million pieces. She realized the man she had betrayed was dying in her arms. Then, sirens filled the air. They grew louder as they neared the house. Olivia sat on the floor, staring at the blood stain on the floor where her husband had fallen. Her mind couldn't process what had just happened. One moment, everything was spiraling out of control. The next, Josh had appeared. The knife gleamed in the dim light. She hadn't even had time to scream before it was over. Mark had barely had a chance to react. His body crumpled to the floor. Now the only sounds were the faint drip of blood and the sirens. When the officers burst through the door, Olivia didn't flinch. Everything felt like a dream. They pulled Josh to his feet. His face was pale, and his hands were covered in blood. He didn't resist. His eyes found Olivia, and for a moment, she saw regret, fear, and love in them. They led him away, and Olivia's body trembled. She knew she couldn't go back. The life she had known was gone. After the attack, Josh was arrested for murder. His obsession with Olivia led him to commit a crime that killed a man and shattered a family. The town of Maplewood was shocked by the scandal. Olivia's life was destroyed by her affair with Josh. Loneliness and desperation had SP spiral into a nightmare. She would live with the guilt of Mark's death. Josh was sentenced to life in prison for second-degree murder. Olivia was alone, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. The story of Olivia and Josh was a cautionary tale. It showed how forbidden desires and unchecked emotions can lead to terrible things. Maplewood was a quiet town. It would never forget the tragedy that happened there. The tragedy was caused by obsession, betrayal, and murder. The Johnson family was rich. They lived on Maple Avenue. Their house was big and had a white picket fence. The Johnsons lived in a house with a white picket fence and a manicured lawn. Michael Johnson was the breadwinner. He was a real estate agent who had made a name for himself in the community. He was admired, respected, and trusted by the townspeople. He was also a perfect husband and father. Michael was a real estate agent and father to 2 children. Sarah was a housewife. She spent her days taking care of the house, the kids, and her husband. Her friends would often say she was lucky to have such a good life. But behind closed doors, things were not as idyllic as they seemed. Sarah's life was dull. She married young, at 22, after finishing her degree in education. She wanted to teach, but became pregnant with Emily. Michael, her husband, was responsible and said she should focus on the family while he handled the finances. It seemed like a fair deal at first, but over time, Sarah wanted more. She wanted more than just being a wife and mother. The passion she once shared with Michael had faded. There was more to the story. Michael's brother Ethan had always been a part of their lives. Ethan was 37 and free-spirited. Ethan was the wild one. He moved from job to job, never staying in one place too long. He was always chasing the next adventure, whether that was hiking, diving, or pursuing creative projects like photography or painting. He was the family's black sheep, yet adored for his charm and spontaneity. Ethan had lived in San Francisco for years, but in 2005 his latest job brought him closer to home in Baltimore, Maryland. He often visited the Johnson home, just an hour's drive from his new apartment. Sarah was excited about this. Unlike Michael, Ethan was attentive, funny, and engaging. He made people feel good about themselves, including Sarah. They started with light-hearted conversations and casual jokes. They started talking about things only they understood. One evening in June, while Michael was away, Ethan came over to help Sarah with a plumbing issue. They ended up sitting on the porch, drinking wine, while the kids played inside. Sarah felt relaxed for the first time in a long time. Ethan's presence was intoxicating. She found herself drawn to him. He told her stories, laughed, and was easygoing. He listened to her in a way Michael hadn't in years. He asked her questions that made her feel seen and heard. But the story doesn't end there. That evening marked the beginning of a dangerous attraction. As the weeks went on, they saw each other more and more. Sometimes he would drop by unannounced. Other times, they would plan for him to come over when Michael was away. They told themselves it was harmless. They just had a brother-in-law. Ethan helped Sarah with chores around the house, but they both knew it was more than that. One night in July, Sarah was sitting in the living room when Ethan arrived with wine. They talked about their lives, dreams, and missed opportunities. Before they knew it, they were kissing. Their lips met in a long, passionate kiss. The affair began. The weeks that followed were a blur of passion and secrecy. Sarah and Ethan met in secret spots around town. She felt alive again, invigorated by the illicit nature of their relationship. Ethan made her feel beautiful, desired, and free. He was everything Michael wasn't. But the guilt began to weigh heavily on Sarah. She loved her children, and the thought of destroying their family tore at her soul. She tried to justify her actions, telling herself that she deserved to feel happy. But she had become addicted to it. The affair was thrilling, but the lies and deceit were becoming harder to manage as summer 2005 ended. Sarah's life began to unravel. Michael noticed changes in her behavior. She seemed distant and distracted. She barely acknowledged him. He brushed it off, thinking she was tired or stressed. Michael noticed the late-night phone calls, secretive texts, and her jump when her phone buzzed. He began to grow suspicious. One evening, while Sarah was out, he went through her phone. He found text messages from Ethan. His world came crashing down. Michael didn't confront Sarah right away. He spent days in silent agony, trying to process the betrayal. He couldn't believe it. Sarah, the woman he had built his life with, was deceiving him. She was having an affair with his brother, Ethan. The tension in the Johnson household became unbearable. Sarah sensed something was off with Michael, but she didn't know what. She continued her affair, unaware that Michael was gathering information and waiting for the right moment to confront her. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally erupted one evening in September. Michael had returned from work early and found Sarah and Ethan in the backyard talking. The sight of them together made him angry. He confronted Sarah in the kitchen. He knew, but she didn't. He said, "I know." She froze. He was angry. He replied, "I know." His voice trembled. Sarah's world was falling apart. She had never intended for the affair to go this far. It had been a way to escape her life, but now it had become dangerous. She tried to explain and apologize, but Michael wasn't interested. He left that night, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt and fear. Tension and unease. Michael refused to speak to Sarah, and Ethan stopped coming around. The once warm and loving home had become cold and silent. Sarah knew she had destroyed her marriage, but she didn't know it would get worse. The weeks turned into months, and the tension grew. Michael had become distant. He went to work and came home, barely speaking to Sarah. He was cold and distant. The man who had been her world was now a stranger. Sarah's guilt and anxiety made her sick. She couldn't sleep or eat. She felt dread. The affair had once her escape from monotony. The affair had now become a chain that bound her to misery and regret. She had lost everything: her husband's trust, her sense of self-worth, and the stability she had taken for granted. Ethan was struggling too. The carefree, adventurous man who had once been the life of the party was now consumed by guilt and shame. He couldn't forgive himself for what he had done to his brother. Sarah had spiraled out of control, and now it was tearing his family apart. He tried to break things off with her, but it was too late. He was trapped in a web of his own making, unable to find a way out. Michael's behavior began to take a darker turn. He became obsessed with the betrayal, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He was drinking more often and staying late at work or going to a bar just to avoid coming home. When he did come home, he would sit in the dark nursing a bottle of whiskey, consumed by thoughts of revenge. One evening in late October, Michael came home earlier than usual. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner for the children. She could sense something was different about him. Once warm and full of life, Michael's eyes held a cold, steely resolve. "Where's Ethan?" he asked. His voice was calm but sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "He's not here," she replied. "He hasn't been here for weeks." Michael stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. Sarah stood there trembling, her heart racing. Something terrible was coming. She knew it, but she didn't know what or how to stop it. Michael's behavior got worse. He would disappear for hours at a time. He was home late at night. He barely spoke. The tension in the house was suffocating. Even the children sensed something was wrong. But there's more. The breaking point came. On a cold November night, Michael had been drinking. When he came home, he was drunk. He stumbled through the door, his clothes and eyes showing he'd been drinking. Sarah was waiting for him. She asked him what was going on. He laughed, making her feel scared. "Talk to me," he slurred. "You've already said everything." He staggered towards her, and Sarah could see the anger boiling beneath the surface. She took a step back, fear gripping her heart. "Michael, please. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." He spat. "You're sorry? Do you know what you've done? You've destroyed everything. You've destroyed me." Sarah could react. Michael grabbed her by the arm. His grip was tight. He pulled her close. His breath was hot against her face. "You think you can just apologize and everything will be okay? You think you can just sweep this under the rug and we can go back to the way things were?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she tried to get away from him. "Please, Michael, let me go," she said. But he pushed her away. She fell to the floor. He was very angry. The children upstairs woke up. Emily and Jake came down the stairs. They were scared. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" they asked. "What's going on?" Emily asked. Michael turned to his children. His expression softened for a moment as he looked at them, but then his gaze hardened again. He ordered, "Go back to bed." His voice was cold and commanding. "This is between your mother and me." But the story doesn't end there. The children were terrified and confused. They hesitated before Emily took Jake by the hand and led him back upstairs. Sarah watched them go. Her heart broke as she realized how she knew she had to end this to protect her children, but Michael had other plans. He left that night, leaving Sarah alone with her fear and guilt. She didn't know where he'd gone or what he was planning, but she knew it wasn't good. Michael's absence became more frequent. When he was home, he was distant and cold. Sarah tried to apologize, but he wouldn't listen. He was consumed by anger and betrayal. There was more. Ethan sensed the growing danger and tried to break off the affair. He called Sarah, urging her to meet him at a secluded spot in Patapsco Valley State Park. Ethan wanted to end things on his terms. He wanted to say goodbye and try to salvage their lives. Sarah drove to the park that evening. She knew that ending the affair was the right thing to do. But she also knew that it wouldn't fix everything. Michael was angry. He was becoming unstable. She feared that when he finally exploded, it would destroy them all. When she arrived at the park, Ethan was waiting for her. Ethan said, "This has to end." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "We've made a mess of everything. I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted it to go this far." But before they could say more, they heard a car engine approaching. Dread filled them as Michael's car pulled up. He got out, his face twisted with rage, and began walking towards them. His eyes were locked on Ethan. Michael's arrival marked the beginning of the end. The confrontation that had been building for months was finally about to erupt. When it did, it would leave a trail of devastation in its wake. The tension in the air was palpable as Michael advanced towards Ethan and Sarah. His steps were deliberate, and his expression was dark. The park, usually calm and peaceful, now felt like the setting of an impending disaster. Sarah's heart raced as she saw Michael's rage. She knew this confrontation would be worse than anything before. Ethan stood his ground, his face a mask of regret and resignation. He knew this moment was inevitable. He knew that the choices he and Sarah had made would lead them. Ethan began, his voice calm but firm. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But this doesn't have to end badly. We can figure this out. Michael's laugh was cold and empty. You think there's anything left to figure out? You betrayed me. Ethan, you both did it. There's nothing to talk about. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between the two brothers. Please, Michael, she pleaded. We made a mistake. We can still fix this for the kids. Please don't do something you'll regret. But Michael was beyond reason. The betrayal he had suffered was too deep, too painful. He had spent months drowning in his anger and pain. Ethan, his former confidant, filled him with rage. Michael reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. The barrel gleamed in the faint light. Sarah gasped. Ethan took a step back, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Michael, Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the empty park. Please don't do this. Michael's hand trembled as he pointed the gun at Ethan. His finger hovered over the trigger. The world seemed to slow down. Every second stretched into an eternity as Sarah watched in terror. Helpless to stop what was about to happen, Ethan raised his hands, trying to plead with his brother. Michael, he urged, you're not supposed to end it like this. Michael's eyes were wild, his mind clouded by rage. You took everything from me. You took my wife, my family, my life. You don't deserve to live. Time seemed to stand still as Michael's finger tightened on the trigger. Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The gunshot rang out, a deafening crack that echoed through the trees. Ethan staggered backward, a look of shock on his face. Ethan fell to the ground, his body crumpling into the dirt as the life drained from his eyes. Sarah fell to her knees beside him, her hand shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at Michael, who stood motionless, the gun still in his hand. What have you done? Sarah sobbed. Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. The gun slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground as he stared at his brother's body. The world was silent, save for Sarah's cries. Michael couldn't comprehend what he had done. A heavy, inescapable blanket settled over them. Michael's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground. The police arrived minutes later, alerted by a passerby who had heard the gunshot. Once serene park was filled with flashing lights and sirens. Officers secured the area and took statements from a distraught Sarah. Michael offered no resistance as the officers handcuffed him and led him away. He was a broken man. They placed him in the back of the squad car and he stared blankly out the window, consumed by the horror he had unleashed. The days that followed were a blur. The news of Ethan's death spread quickly through Willow Creek. The Johnson family, once seen as the epitome of success and stability, had been destroyed. Sarah, now a widow, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She carried the guilt of what had happened. She lost everything, her husband, her lover, her family. Her old life was gone. Michael's trial was quick and harsh. The evidence against him was strong, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He knew he deserved it. He would spend the rest of his days paying for his crime. Michael became a shadow of his former self after committing an unforgivable crime in prison. He was a broken figure, lost in regret and despair. He spent his days in silence, haunted by memories of that night. Sarah was also left to live with the consequences of her actions. She moved away from Willow Creek, unable to bear the memories. She moved away from Maryland to live a quiet life. She still felt guilty about what she had done. Her children, Emily and Jake, were taken in by their grandparents. They tried to protect them from the tragedy, but the children were still affected by losing both parents. The Johnson family was destroyed by secrets, lies, and their own actions. The house was sold, and life returned to normal in Willow Creek. But the memory of the tragedy lingered, a shadow that would never fully disappear. It serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked desires and the devastating consequences of betrayal. Anger can destroy lives. The Johnson family, the American dream, fell victim to the darkness beneath their perfect lives. There were no winners, only survivors. People picked up the pieces of a shattered existence, haunted by their choices. The world moved on, but those touched by the tragedy carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives.